Hi, this is David Bennett with the North Carolina Maritime Museum System, and today we're continuing our multi-part series on the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated and the Great Depression. Today we're covering Part 4, A Rough Start, October 1935 to December 1936, so the first year of operation. So last time we discussed that the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated was a cooperative for fishermen in eastern North Carolina to get through the tough financial times of the Great Depression. And one of the things they aimed to do was to market their seafood products to untapped markets in the central part of the state as well as the western part of the state. And they would try and not to compete with wholesale fish dealers in eastern North Carolina. Well, unfortunately, they didn't realize that there were some fish dealers in the central part of the state as well, and they came into conflict, namely with the Charlotte Fish and Oyster Company, which claimed that the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated was buying their seafood above market value and then turning around and selling it below market value, so thus operating at a loss, and they're using the government grants and loans to cover this loss. Now, this isn't entirely true. This is only sort of perception of reality. What was really going on was that the government was providing uh, grants and loans to get the fisheries co-op up on its feet, and through the first 3 months of operations, they weren't going to sustain them in the long run. It was only in the short term. However, it didn't look good that they're using government money to buy and sell seafood, and that the Charlotte Fish and Oyster Company said that they were losing a lot of major clients, so restaurants and grocery stores. And they said that if the fisheries really wanted to open up new markets, they were really going to have to invest in advertising, which they weren't doing much of at all. Rather, they were competing with established businesses. And you can sort of understand this characterization of the fisheries in this because the Department of Labor Statistics said in one of their publications that the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated was a non competitive project designed to assist in the marketing of fish. But on the outside, it looks more like a regular business that was operating off of government monies. Uh, then the dealers in the eastern part of the state, they turned on the fisheries too because they felt like they were having to compete for the loyalty of um, of their fishermen. Traditionally, you'd have a fisherman would primarily work with one dealer, and he could get unsecured loans to get nets and fuel, and then he'd pay that dealer back with some of his catch. And they develop this sense of loyalty to one another and help each other out. However, when the fisheries came along, they were offering more money to the fishermen than most of the dealers were. And so it was pulling a lot of fishermen away from these well established relationships they had. And these dealers said, whoa, whoa, you know, here's a business using government money to compete with us. This isn't right. And then the fisheries was also just struggling to market seafood products like shrimp in North Carolina because shrimp was consumed in the eastern part of the state, but it wasn't widely consumed in the central and western parts of the state where people were less accustomed to that type of seafood. The real markets for things like shrimp and crabs were in the northern states where there were established markets, and the people up there had an appetite for those seafoods. So the fisheries really had its work cut out for them. They had to educate people in North Carolina about the seafood products that were being produced in their own state. And they had to do away with trying to market oysters because they just couldn't get enough in large enough quantities to really be profitable. And oysters were extremely valuable, but it just didn't work out. Then in February 1936, Rodney Prescott, who was the Secretary of Treasury, resigned. He had been the Director of Public Relations and Education. He had been removed from those positions because the fisheries simply couldn't afford to pay him to do his job. And then he left the board of directors over a difference of opinion. Prescott knew that in order for the North Carolina fisheries to continue and to help the fishermen of eastern North Carolina, it needed to be profitable and sustainable, which it wasn't. It was bleeding money like crazy. John Sykes, on the other hand, the president and general manager of the fisheries, said that success needed to be measured in terms of how many people we're impacting in a positive way. He's like, so what if we don't turn a profit as long as we're helping out our communities? And fortunately, those two, there's so much tension between them that it was just really in the best interest for Prescott to leave in the end. But he left in a very public way. He published an open letter in the Beaufort News highlighting a lot of the problems with the fisheries. And it most might think that wouldn't be a good idea, but it probably was in the best interest of the fisheries because it forced them to confront their issues, particularly their financial issues, which ultimately resulted in an audit that was completed in May 1936, and they realized just how bad the situation was. They were losing a lot of money because their overhead was too high. Um, their facilities were on the cutting edge, somewhat ahead of their time in terms of technology that was available in eastern North Carolina, and they were spending an incredible amount of money processing and packaging seafood to go straight into the grocery stores, spending a lot of money experimenting with different seafood products. They were selling to customers who couldn't pay them back, so there wasn't enough cash flow. Uh, Bookkeeping was in arrears because they couldn't hold on to accountants or bookkeepers, and they were doing high volume business. And then also, there was a bad fishing season. There wasn't enough fish coming through, so they decided to economize, downsize, and focus on the Morehead City plant. So, in May 1936, Manio was shifted to seasonal operations. Southport was also shifted to seasonal operations, and they decided to just focus on the peak months of the shrimp season. And the Belhaven plant was permanently closed because they're having to rent the facilities, and Belhaven just wasn't doing enough business to be profitable. So it was a no-brainer to close that plant down. Unfortunately, um, they were also dealing with a lot of logistical issues in terms of servicing their chapters and members, especially after Manio and Southport went to seasonal work and Belhaven closed completely, leaving only Morehead as the only full-time operational facility. A lot of these small fishing communities in eastern North Carolina were very isolated and difficult to get to. And so getting the seafood products out of there into market was a real challenge, and the fisheries just couldn't afford to do it. So they said, we're no longer going to invest in these communities. Um, and those fishermen were kind of left high and dry. A really good example is South Creek. South Creek's a very small fishing community off the Pamlico River, and it's even today it's a pretty isolated community. And it was one of the first chapters to form under the North Carolina Fisheries. And when they got left out, they weren't really told that they were being left out. They just kind of were. And then they complained and they said, "Sorry, we just can't afford to help you." And so the people were really distraught over the situation. And so, because of that and other reasons, a lot of members just started to leave the organization. Um, Really, the big reasons were fishermen just weren't making enough money, so they temporarily left the profession and started doing other things. Some of them went to go work for government programs and building roads and bridges or doing oyster rehabilitation projects to provide for their family. There was some fishermen just either couldn't or refused to pay the membership fee, so they were dropped. And then some of them couldn't or refused to pay the loans that the fisheries had made to them, so they were dropped. And then a lot of them just didn't like all the bad publicity that the fisheries was getting, and they said, "I'm just going back to the dealers and just going to do business with them." Well, some of the fishermen really saw the fisheries as being a government welfare program that they didn't really feel comfortable with, and they didn't want to have it hand out. So they said, "I'm just going to go and do my own thing and try and survive on my own." And so next time, we're going to go over part five, struggling to survive. So more hardships for the fisheries, and this is going to cover the years 1937 and 1938.